Now, the other area is the ability to share assets and pass assets to each other in that type of relationship. And unfortunately, the world in which we live, when I have a client with which I'm working that's a same-sex couple, I have to ask them, how does your family feel about your relationship? Because one of my major concerns when it comes to same-sex couples is in the event that one of them passes, would their family contest a will that leaves assets in a significant amount to the surviving spouse? And if you're in a same-sex relationship and your family on both sides has no qualms with your relationship, this may not be a concern. But if you are a person who's in a same-sex relationship and you do think that there's a possibility that someone in your family might contest that will, then there's three ways that you can mitigate that risk. The first is appropriate titling of assets. So understanding, we'll put an article in the show notes of this, the difference between things like having an individually owned account or an individual account that transfers on death with a named beneficiary. If you have joint accounts together, understanding the difference between things like joint tenants in common, where you would actually set percentages of ownership that wouldn't necessarily pass to your spouse in the event of your death, versus joint tenants with rights of survivorship, where you are both equal owners of the account. And if one of you were to pass, the other just retains the entire ownership of those assets. The second way is through naming your beneficiaries appropriately. You want to make sure that for any account that can have a beneficiary, that you name it as your spouse. And thankfully, that's not something that can be contested. While a will can be contested, you naming your spouse the beneficiary of your retirement account is not something that can be contested because it's a direct beneficiary that bypasses probate. So if you have not done a good sweep of your accounts and your insurance policies to make sure that you have named your spouse, you want to go through the process of doing so. And then finally, trusts. So we haven't done a ton of estate planning talk on this podcast. We will down the line, but there's something called a revocable trust that bypasses probate. So essentially, you have all of these things that are subject to probate, where the court's going to declare a will valid, or in the absence of a will, determine who is assigned those assets. But you also have things like revocable trust, where you can put assets inside of that trust, and upon your death, they go directly to the beneficiaries of that trust. And when I have same-sex couples who have some concern about how their family might treat their surviving spouse in the event of their death, having a revocable trust is something that I typically recommend so that you can put any of the assets about which you have concern into the trust, as compared to leaving them subject to the probate process.